my recollection, only one person from the public expressing concerns about the regulations that were brought forward at that point. I think entering the process, we would have not anticipated that level of consensus given the range of issues that had been brought forward. On the final page of your memo about this issue, there are a list of, I think, 15 or 16 different topics that were addressed as part of the amendment, which included height, setbacks, lot coverage, impervious surface, and overall floor area. I'll go briefly through some of the data and observations about the past year of implementation. If it would be possible to zoom out on that a little bit. So this is a map of the 1 to 4 unit activity that has taken place since October 1st of 2014. And if we get zoomed out, we'll see some sort of clusters of where this activity is taking place. There's continues to be a lot of tear down and new construction activity in Ward 13 in particular. Ward 12 is seeing a significant amount of new home construction. And you're also seeing a fair number of new homes being constructed in the northern part of Ward 5 and in the southern part of Ward 4.
Just to note, it actually didn't zoom out, so we can't see the 13th ward in particular that you're referencing.
There's a little bit bigger picture. And just to describe this map a little bit, the sort of green and black dots are situations where the rebuild followed the tear down within about a year. The yellow dots are new homes that have been built on lots that were vacant a little bit longer than a year, apparently. And then the red X's, just for the sake of clarification, are demolitions of all types, which could be commercial uses on corridors to make way for larger redevelopments, for example. Those are not just 1 to 4 unit teardowns. In terms of building height and floor area, just some of the data that we've compiled of homes that have been built since that time. Somewhat counterintuitively, we've actually seen a slight increase in the average height of new homes during that time, and a slight increase in the average floor area. There's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison in the floor area, though, in that the new regulations require that the entire, when you have an attached garage, the entire garage is counted as floor area, whereas that was not the case previously. In terms of height, when we drafted the new regulations, we had found that in the years leading up to the amendment, about 7 or 8% of the homes that were being constructed would not have complied with the new regulations. So to a large degree, there were these outliers that were generating a lot of concerns from neighboring property owners in particular. So we've essentially addressed those outliers. Those outliers are no longer being constructed. Again, about 7 or 8% of the homes that were being constructed just simply cannot be constructed under today's more strict rules. We, in our site plan review regulations, included an incentive to address the issue of taller homes being built in an area where there's a shorter context. We give points essentially for being within a half story of the predominant context in an area. We're still sort of monitoring how well that provision is working and whether there's a way to get at those disparate heights that we're seeing in some cases are relatively jarring. We did make a change, a relatively modest change earlier this year there was a provision that we discovered that we brought forward a recommendation that turned out to be a little too strict, and that addressed the issue of how much of a basement can extend above grade before it has to be counted as floor area. We had dropped that measurement down from 4 feet to 2.5 feet. We were finding that there are actually quite a few existing homes, century-old homes, that don't comply with that standard. So when people were going to construct additions, they were actually being told, "We're sorry, your existing home is over the allowed FAR, so you can't even do an addition." So we've slightly amended that back up to a 3.5-foot level, where how far a basement can extend above grade before it has to be counted as floor area. Also, in terms of contextual issues, we wanted to make sure we weren't drafting regulations that prevented people from constructing homes that matched a character that included relatively large homes on relatively small lots. So you may recall that there's an exception that comes into play for both height and floor area when the context of the area includes floor area ratio over 0.5 or height over the 33 feet. That is now the maximum. This is a picture that has been going around on Twitter a little bit. It's actually a new construction in Ward 10. Want to be very clear that that's not a new single-family home. This is actually a 4-unit building that's being constructed in a higher density zoning district. I think people were a little surprised by the height of that building. Just to be clear, that's not a new single-family home. That could not be constructed in our lower density zoning districts. This is just a visual representation of the site plan review standards. Just to recall that the site plan review standards for new homes through 4-unit buildings are distinct and separate from the standards that apply to larger development projects, apartments, or mixed-use developments. So in addition to meeting sort of minimum zoning standards, a new project has to obtain at least 17 points off of this range of options. Some interesting things to note, since the new regulations were adopted in October, we're seeing homes taking advantage of a wider range of the points of the design features to meet their minimum point threshold. Previously, about 5 on average, 5 design features were being utilized to comply with the minimum number of points. We're seeing something closer to an average of 6 of these features being utilized to comply with the site plan review regulations now. The new regulations include a much greater emphasis on higher quality materials, and we have seen a corresponding increase in 83% of the homes that have been constructed or approved for zoning purposes since October 1st of 2014. They have utilized higher quality exterior building materials. That 83% compares to 70% previously. One interesting thing to note is that we drafted in an alternative compliance mechanism where if a project was unable to comply with the minimum number of points, there is a way to request an alternative to that. And to date, since October, we have not had a single request for alternative compliance. Projects have either come in the door having met the standards or were altered in a way that they could achieve the minimum threshold. So overall, our assessment is that the new regulations are working quite well. It was a relatively large collection of relatively small changes, I think, based on feedback from the staff who are implementing the ordinance, as well as people in the community and builders and architects. We think that we've struck a reasonable balance in the competing objectives that are present in teardowns and new construction in lower density districts. As noted in the memo for this item, we're looking for the council's feedback about a policy question related to CPED's analysis of new homes. The issue of substantial renovation or virtual teardowns continues to be a difficult one. We are working on a memorandum that will hopefully provide additional guidance to people who are engaging in substantial renovation to the extent that they're removing more than 60% of the structure. I think these photos are maybe a little dark, but a recent example is a property owner took this home and brought it down to that, essentially. In this case, it didn't come all the way down to the foundation, but all of the exterior materials were removed, which was not consistent with the plans that were approved by staff. And when this level of demolition takes place, we essentially say that whatever is built after that has to comply with today's regulations, both in terms of site plan review standards as well as required yards. That has triggered at least several variances that have come forward to the Board of Adjustment, and staff has sort of struggled with how to address those variances. Recall that property owner has to show practical difficulty in making their case for a variance. Staff has often found that the practical difficulty has been the location of the existing foundation. And the Board of Adjustment has provided some feedback to us that perhaps there should be more than just the foundation as the unique quality that justifies the granting of a variance. Essentially, if that kind of variance becomes automatic, the thought is that it circumvents the intent of the regulations that in some cases required larger setbacks, particularly on wider lots. So we're looking for some feedback from the council on that particular policy question. But other than that, as stated, we think the regulations are being implemented pretty well.
Thank you. Are there questions for staff? Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate this update, and I guess this is more just a comment and maybe something that we can just take offline, but it seems like, you know, having the second most tear downs in the city, in my ward, that there's kind of two concerns. One is around the size and the fit of the new home into the neighborhood, but the other is really around the loss of our great housing stock. And it seems like a lot of times I look at these homes that are being requested permits to wreck them and to tear them down for these rebuilds. It seems like they're extremely dilapidated, ready to fall apart. It wouldn't economically make sense to fix them up. So I guess it's just feedback or a comment that I think it would be helpful if there was some way, and I don't know if there is an easy way, to better understand that and kind of address that concern by the community of, hey, what type of homes are these? Are we really seeing people buy a great in shape family home and just tear it down just for the land? Or is it really instances where it's not possible to rehabilitate? So that's just some feedback. No response needed.
Thank you.
Mr. Wickenberg, I was wondering, were these all single family homes in the analysis that you provided? And I just wondered if we're seeing any duplex, triplex, or fourplex new construction, and if so, how we know this is working or might work for those slightly different unit types.
Sure, Chair Bender. I don't have the specific numbers of single family versus 2 or 3 or 4 family. This map does include, and that analysis did include 2, 3, and 4 unit buildings as well. However, the vast majority, 90% or more of the projects that appear on that map are certainly single family. An argument could be made that the regulations are not a perfect fit for sort of 3 and 4 unit buildings. And also, as you know, we're quite restrictive in terms of where you can build duplexes in the city. Since the mid-90s, we've had a relatively large minimum lot area requirement for duplexes in our R2B district, which is our duplex district. I think the effect of that, however, has perhaps been mitigated a bit by the fact that we now allow accessory dwelling units. So on a 5,000 square foot lot in R2B, you can build and own or construct an accessory dwelling unit, either new or accessory to an existing structure. So I wonder if that makes it a little bit less urgent for us to re-examine those minimum lot area requirements in R2B if people do have a mechanism to get 2 units on those properties.
Thank you. I think that's an interesting point. I'm curious about this general policy topic area of 2, 3, and 4 unit buildings. And I think particularly in my ward, I was joking with Councilmember Palmisano that in her ward, people want to tear down smaller homes and build larger ones. But in my ward, I actually hear people say that the homes are too big for their needs and they want smaller green homes. So just to think a different housing market, a different part of town, a different historic fabric there. But I think there are parts of the city where some of the form is of much larger homes where these 2, 3, and 4 unit buildings might fit in really well with the character if there ever is a market for new construction in that space. So anyway, I think it's a future topic area. Councilmember Palmisano, did you want to talk about this foundation issue?
Sure, if I may, just have a couple comments about the analysis. First, I want to thank Jason Wittenberg for his work, not only on the presentation, but the analysis and on serving as the lead on this work over the last 18 months. That's been no small task. I'd also like to thank Brad Ellis, Joe Giant, and Andrew Friends for all of their help too. 1 year ago today, and Mr. Wittenberg is right, exactly 1 year ago today, the zoning infill text amendment for 1 to 4 units became effective, and that really marked a change in the way that we give permits to build and renovate homes across the city. Mr. Wittenberg's map shows approvals post October 1st. The reason why this might not map to your own notice of new development in your own ward is there were a number of proposals that came in right before that October 1st deadline where building didn't actually start until sometime late spring or this summer. So I actually experienced quite a bit more in my part of town than what you see on this map. And I know from driving through others that there's a lot more building development out there in the mostly single family residential space. The goal of these amendments were reasonable standards that improved outcomes for all Minneapolis neighborhoods and residents. And I think it's clear from the data that they've gathered that we've achieved that goal. While a negotiation also often means that both sides are a little bit dissatisfied, I do think these changes strike a healthy balance between the concerns of existing residents and the desires of homeowners. I think the results speak for themselves. New homes are taking up a smaller amount of impervious surface, and there's more room between them and their neighbors. A higher percentage of these homes have high quality exterior materials. I know that to be particularly important for some of the council members. A higher percentage of new homes are obtaining points for a large amount of window area on all sides of the structure. And although the bar was set much higher for tree preservation and planting, the same percentage of homes are achieving those points. I'd like it to be more. We'll continue efforts on that. So my great thanks to all of you as well as council members for participating in my efforts with expertise that you've brought from all of your areas that you represent. As Mr. Wittenberg mentioned and Chair Bender, I've worked on a motion that I've constructed with Chair Bender to take a closer look at those foundations to say that basically is not a practical difficulty when you're taking something down to the foundation of a house that you don't necessarily get to keep those setbacks in the way that they would be evaluated for a variance. So I think that is what is before you, and that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm happy to move the staff direction that Councilmember Palmisano worked on with staff, which is to provide a higher level of scrutiny related to this issue that Mr. Wittenberg described, where the setbacks are impacted by the existing foundations. And this just clarifies how we intend to treat existing foundations and gives direction to the Board of Adjustment that the foundation should not be the only unique factor that leads to the conclusion that a property owner is faced with a practical difficulty. And again, this is to just clarify the intention of the original policy that we adopted. Any discussion on the staff direction? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay. That carries. And that was our final item. We are adjourned. Thank you so much.